My name is Grace, and for most of my adult life, I believed that patience was the glue that held a family together. I thought that if I worked hard, stayed quiet, and supported everyone around me, eventually they would appreciate my efforts. But I learned slowly, painfully, that silence doesn't earn respect, and kindness without boundaries becomes an invitation for people to take more than they should. Growing up, I was always the reliable daughter, the one who did her homework on time, the one who helped my mother in the kitchen without being asked, the one who tried to keep the peace between my parents when arguments broke out over money or my father's temper. My younger sister, Lily, on the other hand, floated through life like someone who believed the world owed her comfort. She was beautiful, charming in a careless kind of way, and smart enough to skate by without putting in any real effort. My parents adored her, maybe because she was the baby of the family, maybe because she had a way of turning small problems into big dramas that demanded their attention, or maybe simply because loving her was easier. I never envied her, not at first. I just accepted that I was the strong one, the stable one, the one who fixed things. That belief followed me into adulthood, shaping the way I lived and the choices I made. While Lily partied through her early 20s, hopping from job to job, quitting as soon as the workload annoyed her, I took the opposite path. I studied hard, graduated, found a steady job, and built a life I thought everyone would be proud of. When my father lost his job, I stepped in. When my mother's medical bills piled up, I stepped in. And when Lily's debt from impulsive shopping and ill-advised business plans spiraled out of control, I stepped in again. Because no one else would. At first, I didn't see it as a burden. I told myself helping family was natural. But somewhere along the way, the weight of being responsible for everyone else became a quiet, steady pressure in my chest. Still, I pushed through. I convinced myself that they were going through a tough phase, that things would eventually settle. Except they didn't. My support became their expectation. My sacrifices became invisible, and the more I gave, the less they seemed to see me as someone who needed emotional space, care, or even simple respect. Despite all this, I never complained. I truly believed that staying calm, keeping the peace, and being understanding would avoid conflict and win their appreciation. But the truth is, some people take calmness as weakness. They take kindness as permission, and they take you for granted until the day you finally say enough. That realization didn't come all at once. It built slowly over months, maybe years, as I noticed the small ways my family dismissed me, like how my mother joked that I worked too much and should relax a little, even though my long hours were the reason she had the medication she needed. Or how my father casually assumed I'd cover utilities at their house without asking. Or how Lily, whenever she was short on cash, which was often, would send me messages with a dramatic sigh, saying things like, "Grace, you know how hard my life is," as if hardship were a competition she wanted to win without doing any of the actual work. I didn't resent them at first. I told myself they were stressed, overwhelmed, doing the best they could. But a small, quiet ache formed inside me, a feeling I didn't want to name, because naming it meant admitting something painful, that the people I loved most didn't value me. Still, I kept going. I avoided confrontation because I thought it would make things worse. I thought being the mature one meant swallowing hurt feelings and pretending everything was fine. The turning point, the night everything changed, didn't feel like a dramatic explosion. It felt like a slow cracking, a pressure point finally giving way. It was a family dinner on a Sunday evening. I remember the warm smell of my mother's cooking, the soft clatter of plates, the dim yellow light above our dining table. I had come straight from work, still tired, still carrying the kind of exhaustion that isn't just physical but emotional, the kind that settles behind your ribs and makes even breathing feel heavier. I greeted everyone with a smile, because that's what I always did, even when inside, I felt like I was running on fumes. Lily was already there, dressed nicely as if she were going to a brunch with friends rather than a simple family dinner. She had that confident smirk on her face, the one she wore whenever she wanted attention. My parents were in a cheerful mood, unusually lighthearted. My father had poured himself a drink. My mother hummed softly as she set out the food, and for a moment, I let myself believe it would be a peaceful evening. But trouble doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it slips into the room wrapped in a joke. We sat down to eat, and for a few minutes, the conversation was harmless work. The weather, a neighbor my mother didn't like. Then Lily looked at me, tilted her head in that condescending way she'd perfected years ago, and said, "Grace, where's your husband and kids?" "Oh, right. You don't have any." She said it with a laugh, the kind that cuts because it pretends to be innocent. My parents laughed too. Not a big laugh, not a cruel one, just a casual chuckle, as if her words were harmless. But something in me collapsed quietly. It wasn't just the comment, it was everything behind it, the implication that my worth was measured by whether I had a family of my own, the dismissal of my achievements, the erasure of all I had done for them, the years of sacrifice, the bills paid, the late night worry, the impossible hours at work. It all shrank into nothing in the face of that one mocking question. I sat there, frozen, feeling my chest tighten. For a moment, I almost did what I always did. I almost smiled and brushed it off, letting the moment pass. But the laughter kept echoing, my father shaking his head amused, my mother covering her mouth, Lily smirking proudly at her own joke. Something inside me refused to stay silent this time. I placed my fork down slowly, calmly. I looked at Lily not with anger, but with a clarity I had never felt before. And in that steady, quiet voice I always used, I said, "Where's your money, Lily?" The table went still instantly. "Oh, right," I continued. "I've been supporting you. Actually, I've been supporting all of you." My mother blinked. My father stopped mid-breath. Lily's smile disappeared like it had been wiped off her face. I could feel my heart beat in my fingertips, but my voice didn't shake. For the first time, I wasn't swallowing my truth. I was letting it out. Until today, I added softly. The silence that followed felt heavier than any shouting match could have been. It was the first time they looked at me not as the dependable daughter or convenient helper, but as someone who had finally drawn a line. And in that moment, I realized something else. This wasn't just about one comment. It was about years of being overlooked, minimized, and used. And that was the night everything changed, not because I lashed out, but because for the first time, I chose myself. I didn't know it then, but that quiet sentence would be the start of a very long, very painful unraveling, and eventually, a revenge I never imagined I was capable of. But before any of that could happen, I had to face the truth of what my family had become and what I had allowed them to turn me into. For a long moment after I told them I was done supporting them, the silence at the dinner table felt so heavy that I could almost hear it pressing against my ears like a thick fog, settling inside the room, swallowing every sound except the slow beating of my own heart. My father was the first to break eye contact, shifting uncomfortably in his chair as if he had just realized he'd been sitting on something sharp for years and finally felt the sting. My mother looked confused in that familiar way that always appeared whenever the family dynamic didn't go the way she had planned. And Lily, her face twisted from shock to irritation, then to something sharper, like she was trying to understand how I, the unpredictable sister, had dared to embarrass her. Yet I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt tired. Deep, bone-level tired. The kind that comes not from lack of sleep, but from years of swallowing words you should have said. And tonight all those unsaid words were sitting behind my ribs, pressing outward, waiting to be acknowledged. My mother finally cleared her throat and said, "Grace, that's not necessary, dear." You know she was just joking. But it was the way she said just joking, dismissing both the insult and the years of financial strain I had carried for them, that ignited something inside me. Not flames, just a quiet heat that felt like truth rising to the surface. "Mom," I said gently, A joke stops being a joke when it hurts and when it's repeated. She opened her mouth, but said nothing, closing it again like she didn't have the right words or didn't want to accept the ones forming in her mind. Lily rolled her eyes, scoffing loudly. Oh, please, Grace. You're being dramatic. It's not my fault you're, lonely. The word stung, less because she said it and more because she said it so casually, like it was the simplest thing in the world to cut someone open. I took a slow breath. I realized if I lost control, even just a little, they would twist this into me being unreasonable, emotional, ungrateful. So I stayed calmer than I felt. Lonely is better than being irresponsible, I replied quietly. The flash of hurt in Lily's expression was quick, but it was there, and it told me that somewhere deep down, she knew the truth even if she refused to face it. My father leaned forward, his voice gruver than usual. Grace, don't talk to your sister like that. She's going through a hard time. I almost laughed. A hard time. That phrase had been Lily's shield for over a decade, a convenient excuse that allowed her to dodge responsibility, accountability, and sometimes even basic decency. But instead of laughing, I simply asked, and when have I not been going through a hard time? No one answered, because we all knew the truth. My struggles were invisible to them as long as I kept everything functioning. The bills I paid, the hours I worked, the sacrifices I made, they were part of the family's silent expectations. And now that I had broken the silence, nobody knew what to do. The room felt colder as the weight of my words settled. My mother tried to regain control of the situation by redirecting the conversation. Let's just eat. We can discuss this later. But the problem was never the timing. The problem was that later always meant never in this family. So I refused to let the moment dissolve into routine. No, I said firmly but softly. We need to talk about this now. My father's jaw tightened. He hated conflicts, but only when I was the one initiating them. When Lily cried over losing a job or complained about bills she couldn't pay, he was patient, attentive, sympathetic. But when I expressed something genuine, something difficult, he always wanted to move on quickly, like my feelings were a stray thread that had to be trimmed to keep the family fabric neat. What is there to talk about? Lily snapped suddenly. You're acting like you did us some huge favor. Families help each other. It's not a big deal. It is when it's one-sided, I replied. It's a big deal when I'm supporting all of you and you mock me instead of respecting me. My mother whispered my name like a warning. Grace, but I wasn't done. Years of silence had given me so much to say. Do you know how many times Ivy skipped meals to pay for things you needed? I asked, looking at Lily. Do you know how many nights I stayed awake worrying about your expenses, or Mama's medicine, or Dad's repairs for the house? I turned to my parents. Do you remember how many times you pushed Lily's responsibilities onto me because she was sensitive or because I was strong enough to handle it? The answers were written on their faces. Denial, discomfort, shame, anger, everything blending into a messy expression they couldn't hide. Lily crossed her arms and looked away, muttering something under her breath. I didn't ask her to repeat it. I didn't need to. I knew it was another dismissal, another attempt to minimize what I had done. That was when it hit me, not suddenly, but like the slow settling of a truth I should have seen years ago. They were never going to admit what I meant to them, because doing so would force them to confront how much they had taken advantage of me. So I didn't wait for their acknowledgement. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back. The sound was soft, but felt loud in the tense room. I'm done helping financially, I said. From today onward, my father frowned deeply. You can't just cut us off like that. Yes, I answered, I can. My mother looked worried. But what about the utility bills next month? And the loan payment? You know, we're still struggling. I nodded, not as an apology, but as understanding. I know. But I can't rescue everyone anymore. It's not healthy. Not for me, Lily scoffed again. So what? You think you're better than us now? That question hurt, because it revealed exactly how she saw me. No, I said softly. I just think I deserve respect. She rolled her eyes dramatically, like the idea was ridiculous. And that was when something shifted inside me. I realized this moment wasn't only about ending the financial cycle. It was about ending the emotional pattern that kept me trapped. So I added, and until I get it from all of you, I'm stepping back. My mother's face paled. What do you mean, stepping back? I looked around the table, meeting each of their eyes. It means I won't be around as much. I need space. Lily laughed bitterly. Oh, give me a break. Where will you go? You're always here. You don't even have a family of your own. This place is all you've got. Her words were meant to sting, but instead they clarified everything. I smiled sadly. Lily, that's exactly the problem. The room fell silent again. This time, no one tried to make excuses or lighten the mood. They all knew that something profound had shifted, even if they didn't understand how deep the crack was. I didn't storm out. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I simply gathered my things, thanked my mother for the meal, and walked to the door. As I slipped on my shoes, I heard my father mutter in a voice that was supposed to be quiet, but wasn't he quiet enough? She'll be back. She always comes back, and maybe once, years ago, that would have been true. But that night something changed in me, not in anger, but in clarity. I opened the door, stepped outside, and let the cool evening air wash over me. It felt like the first deep breath I had taken in years. I didn't know what I was walking toward yet, but I knew what I was walking away from, the version of myself who believed love meant carrying everyone else's weight while hiding my own. What I didn't realize at that moment was that stepping away would set off a chain of events, unexpected reactions, hidden truths, painful confrontations that would push me into a kind of revenge I never planned, but eventually embraced. And as I walked to my car, the night sky felt wider than ever, as if my life was finally expanding into something new, even if I didn't yet know the cost. The next few days after that dinner felt strange and almost unreal, as if the air around me had shifted and I was suddenly seeing my family through new eyes. Eyes that were no longer blinded by obligation or habit. I went back to my apartment, to the small but cozy space I had carved out for myself over the years, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like a refuge instead of a pit stop between responsibilities. I spent those days reflecting on everything, the countless times I had lent money, covered bills, given advice that went unheeded, and smoothed over conflicts that weren't mine to fix. I thought about Lily and how effortlessly she had learned to manipulate the adults in the house, how my parents had rewarded charm and excuses over diligence and integrity, and I felt a mixture of sadness, exhaustion, and a strange, simmering anger I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge before. For the first time, I realized that my support hadn't been appreciated. It had been expected, taken for granted, and even ridiculed. And that realization, while painful, carried a quiet sense of liberation. I started keeping track of all the money I had spent over the years, the countless hours I had sacrificed, the emotional labor I had performed that no one had ever credited me for. And it was staggering. Suddenly, I could see the imbalance clearly. I could see how much I had carried without complaint, and I could see how little recognition or gratitude I had received in return. I also noticed something else, a feeling that I could do something different now, that I could reclaim control over my own life. It wasn't about revenge yet, not in the explosive, dramatic way movies make it seem, but it was about asserting boundaries, about no longer being the invisible backbone of a family that treated me as dispensable. I reached out to a few close friends during those days, people I trusted, to listen without judgment, and explained what had happened at the dinner. Their reactions were validating and grounding. They reminded me that I wasn't overreacting, that years of financial and emotional support deserved acknowledgement, and that stepping away didn't make me cold or unkind. It made me self-aware and finally brave enough to take care of myself. The first week, I didn't speak to my parents or Lily. I didn't call, I didn't text, and I didn't respond to messages they sent me. I watched from a distance as they tried to function without my immediate intervention. And what I noticed was telling. Bills weren't being paid on time. Small disputes between Lily and my parents began to escalate as my mother's patience ran thin without me to act as the buffer. And my father grew irritable and frustrated over matters I had always quietly handled. Lily, of course, acted as if nothing was wrong. But I saw the cracks in her behavior. She was uncomfortable, restless, snapping at minor annoyances, and I realized that for all her arrogance, she had grown used to the safety net I provided. That realization didn't make me gloat. It made me thoughtful, because I understood that for revenge to be meaningful, it wasn't about shaming or hurting someone publicly. It was about allowing the truth to surface naturally, allowing consequences to follow actions without my interference anymore. I began planning carefully. I created a detailed ledger of every expense I had covered, every favor I had done, every debt I had essentially carried without recognition, and I saved documents, receipts, and bank statements. I wanted irrefutable clarity, because I knew that if I ever had to confront them directly about the imbalance, I needed facts, not feelings alone. While doing this, I also spent time reflecting on the emotional toll. I journaled, noting how I felt when I was ignored or ridiculed, the subtle resentments that had built over time, and how anger and sadness intertwined in a way that made me physically tense. Writing it down made it real and gave me the perspective I needed. I could see my journey from naive generosity to assertive clarity, and it gave me a quiet strength. I also had to prepare myself mentally for their reactions, because I knew they wouldn't be passive in this. I imagined the conversations, the attempts at guilt-tripping, the manipulations, and I rehearsed my responses, making sure I would stay calm, collected, and focused on the truth rather than being drawn into old patterns of blame or apology. Gradually, I realized that my revenge wouldn't be about yelling or humiliation. It would be about walking away from the role I had been forced into, letting them face the consequences of their dependence, and asserting my independence. A week later, Lily called me, her voice feigning cheerfulness. "Hey Grace, dinner tonight at Mom and Dad's. Don't be a stranger," she said, attempting to make things seem normal, like nothing had changed. I didn't answer immediately. I let the call go to voicemail and spent several minutes breathing, listening to my own thoughts instead of hers. And then I replied with a simple, calm text. "I can't make it tonight. I'm taking some time for myself." There was no explanation, no apology, no invitation back, just a boundary. That silence on my end unnerved her. I could tell by her frantic messages later, and it gave me a small, unspoken satisfaction. Days turned into weeks, and my absence began to have an impact at home. Lily tried subtly to draw my attention back, sending pictures of herself at new restaurants or mentioning debts she couldn't pay. But I maintained my distance. I knew that if I gave in even slightly, I would be back in the cycle of sacrifice and disregard. And then something else happened, something I hadn't anticipated. My parents began to argue more openly about finances. My father grumbled about late bills. My mother fretted over unpaid utilities. And Lily, frustrated by the loss of her usual safety net, began lashing out in small ways. It wasn't cruel or dramatic, it was just life adjusting to the absence of someone who had always silently carried it for them. I watched from a distance, keeping track of developments, feeling neither guilty nor vindictive, just clear-eyed. I also began to focus on myself in ways I hadn't before. I invested in my career, took up new hobbies, and reconnected with friends I had neglected. The more I focused on myself, the less the absence of their gratitude hurt me. Slowly, I began to feel lighter, freer, and more grounded. My revenge, I realized, wasn't about hurting them, it was about reclaiming my own life and teaching them, silently but surely, that my presence came with respect and reciprocity, not blind obligation. I didn't need to announce it loudly. I only needed to remain consistent, calm, and firm. Weeks later, the inevitable confrontation began to simmer. Lily called again, her tone sharper this time. "Grace, this has gone too far. Mom and Dad are worried. You're being ridiculous." I responded with quiet clarity, explaining that my support was no longer unconditional and that it would only resume when it was appreciated and reciprocated appropriately. My words weren't cruel, but they were firm, and for the first time, I felt fully in control. They didn't like it, but there was nothing they could do to make me bend to old patterns. And in that quiet, steady assertion, I began to sense the beginnings of real change, not just in my family, but in myself. I realized that the power I had quietly accumulated through patience, sacrifice, and emotional labor wasn't gone, it was simply redirected. Instead of being at their disposal, it was now at my disposal. And that realization was exhilarating, calm, and precise all at once. It was the beginning of the end for the family dynamic that had defined my life for decades, and the beginning of a story where I finally set the rules, where my worth wasn't measured by others' convenience or amusement, and where the quiet, calm, and methodical strength I had cultivated over the years became the force behind my personal awakening and the measured revenge I was only beginning to understand. As the weeks passed, I began to notice subtle shifts not just in my family, but within myself, the kind of changes that are almost imperceptible at first, like the way a river gradually carves a canyon over decades, until one day you realize the landscape has been completely transformed. I was no longer the same Grace who would silently absorb criticism or cover for mistakes, the one whose presence was taken for granted. Each day, as I invested time in myself, my confidence grew in ways I hadn't anticipated. I started setting personal goals, small ones at first, like creating a more organized budget for my own finances, enrolling in a night class to expand my career skills, and dedicating quiet mornings to reading books I had long ignored. These were seemingly small acts, but in a household that had long depended on me for everything, they were revolutionary. Meanwhile, I observed the consequences of my absence at home. My parents, previously so reliant on me, were now scrambling to keep things together. Dad's frustration over bills had turned into long, quiet sighs that even Lily couldn't dismiss, and Mom's gentle reminders to call Grace sounded more like panic than casual advice. Lily, for her part, oscillated between indignation and anxiety. She tried to reach me in indirect ways, posting pictures on social media with captions about being broke or stressed, knowing I would see them. But I resisted. I didn't respond, didn't comment, and didn't offer a lifeline. For the first time, she was experiencing the kind of discomfort I had silently endured for years. One afternoon, as I was leaving my office, I received a text from my mother that simply read, "We need to talk." I stared at it for a long moment, feeling no panic, no obligation, only a calm curiosity. I responded with a neutral, "Yes, we can talk tomorrow," and returned to my day. That calm distance was the first step in my calculated approach, my quiet revenge, not dramatics, not confrontation, but a shift in the balance of dependence that had long been skewed against me. Over the next few days, small events unfolded that reinforced my resolve. Lily mismanaged an important bill, leaving the account overdrawn. My parents argued about how to cover it. I stayed away, observing quietly from the periphery, understanding that the universe had a way of enforcing lessons without my direct interference. I spent that time improving my life, focusing on financial independence, personal growth, and emotional resilience. Slowly, I began to plan my eventual confrontation with clarity, not impulsively, but methodically. I wanted it to be precise, undeniable, and transformative. I began gathering evidence not as a weapon to humiliate, but as proof of the imbalance that had long existed, to confront not only Lily, but my parents with the truth they had chosen to ignore. Receipts, bank statements, emails, and text messages accumulated into a clear record of years in which I had been the family's silent provider. Each piece of evidence reminded me of the countless small moments where my efforts had gone unacknowledged. Every act of care that had been dismissed, every financial contribution that had been seen as an obligation rather than a gift. While I documented these, I also documented my feelings, my emotional labor, and the ways in which my family's behavior had affected me. This dual record, financial and emotional, would form the foundation of the confrontation I was planning, ensuring that it would be rooted in fact, clarity, and fairness. I didn't rush. Part of my calm revenge was patience. I knew that emotions could cloud judgment, that anger could lead to rush actions, and that a true shift in power required timing, precision, and unshakable calm. I began envisioning how I would present everything not with hostility, but with clarity, so that my family could no longer deny their patterns. I reflected on the dinner when everything had changed. The shock on Lily's face when I mentioned the money, the way my parents had gone silent, and the mix of fear, disbelief, and indignation that had crossed their features. I realized that confrontation, if done correctly, didn't have to be loud or dramatic. It could be quiet, firm, and unyielding, and its impact could be far greater than any shouting match. During this period, I also began examining my own behavior. I asked myself why I had tolerated so much, why I had allowed my kindness to be mistaken for weakness, and why I had never demanded respect before. This self-reflection was uncomfortable but necessary. I had to understand my own patterns so I wouldn't repeat them. I realized that my patience had once been a strength, but without boundaries, it had become a liability, allowing others to exploit me emotionally and financially. A crucial part of my plan, therefore, was not only to confront my family, but also to redefine my role in it, to set clear boundaries that would protect me from being drained again. One evening, a month after the fateful dinner, I decided it was time to test the waters. I called Lily directly, keeping my tone calm, steady, and neutral. Lily, I want to discuss our finances and the support I've provided over the years. I think it's time we clarify expectations moving forward. Her reaction was telling. There was a pause, a stutter, a subtle pitch in her voice that betrayed her discomfort. She agreed to meet, but I could sense she expected me to back down, to soften my tone, to allow her to evade accountability. I didn't promise anything. I didn't apologize. I simply stated the facts as clearly as I could, leaving no room for manipulation or evasion. My parents, upon hearing of the meeting, were skeptical, trying to warn me that I was being harsh, that families shouldn't keep score, and that I should forgive and forget. But I knew forgiveness without boundaries wasn't what I needed. I needed recognition and fairness. And so, when the day arrived, I went to meet Lily at a neutral location, a quiet cafe where the noise of life would drown out any distractions, but not the gravity of our conversation. I had my notes, my receipts, my mental preparation, and a calm resolve that I had never felt before. The meeting began awkwardly, with Lily attempting to charm and disarm, joking about our past, laughing about old memories, and trying to pull me into familiar patterns. But I stayed firm, calm, and precise. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I simply presented the facts, the cumulative record of support I had provided, and contrasted it with the years of disregard and ridicule I had endured. I could see her expression shift from smugness to unease, a flicker of something that resembled guilt or fear passing across her face, though she tried to mask it. I watched carefully, noting every reaction, because each one told me she was beginning to understand the reality she had ignored for so long. My parents were not present, but the preparation I had done to communicate effectively meant that even Lily's defenses could not hold against the weight of clarity, calm, and undeniable truth. And in that quiet confrontation, I realized that the revenge I was orchestrating wasn't about vengeance in the dramatic sense. It was about restoring balance, asserting self-respect, and allowing natural consequences to emerge from the patterns that had long been overlooked, ignored, or abused. After that meeting with Lily, I felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation, the kind that comes when you finally speak a long-held truth and realize that your voice has power, not the explosive, dramatic power that shouts and rattles walls, but a steady, undeniable force that shifts the balance quietly, invisibly, yet irrevocably. In the days that followed, I noticed small but significant changes. Lily, who had once moved through life with a sense of entitlement and invincibility, became more cautious, more calculating. She no longer assumed I would bail her out at the first sign of trouble. Text messages asking for money became less frequent. Excuses for mistakes became more subdued. I could sense her frustration, the same frustration I had once felt but had never expressed, and it gave me a quiet satisfaction, not because I wanted to punish her, but because it signaled that she was beginning to see the consequences of her actions, the natural outcomes of reliance without responsibility. Meanwhile, my parents were forced to confront the reality that their dependable daughter had finally set boundaries. At first, they tried the usual tactics, pleading, guilt-tripping, subtle hints about family loyalty, but I remained calm, consistent, and firm. I explained, in measured tones, that support had to be mutual, that respect could not be one-sided, and that I would continue to be a part of their lives, but only under conditions that acknowledged my contributions and respected my autonomy. The tension in those conversations was palpable. My father, usually quick to deflect or suppress conflict, struggled to find words that could justify years of expectation without gratitude. My mother, typically a mediator, seemed torn between relief that I was finally standing up for myself and fear of what this change meant for the family dynamic. And Lily, she oscillated between indignation and begrudging acknowledgement, her expressions a mix of disbelief and reluctant understanding. I knew then that revenge, in its most effective form, didn't require theatrics. It required patience, precision, and the quiet demonstration that my absence and assertiveness had consequences that could no longer be ignored. Over the following weeks, I continued to build my own life, fully investing in my career, friendships, and personal growth. I took long walks, spent evenings reading, and allowed myself to explore interests that I had long postponed because of the constant demands of my family. Each step felt like reclamation or reclaiming of time, energy, and emotional space that I had unconsciously surrendered for decades. And as I expanded my own life, I noticed that my confidence radiated outward, subtly altering the way my family interacted with me. They were no longer able to take my presence for granted, no longer able to assume that my support was automatic. Instead, they began to approach me with genuine attention, respect, and in some moments, even apology. I didn't demand gratitude. I allowed it to rise naturally, because true recognition is meaningful only when it is earned. One evening, several weeks after the initial confrontation with Lily, she came to my apartment unannounced. She sat awkwardly on the sofa, avoiding my gaze, and after a long pause, she said quietly, "Grace, I think I understand now. I didn't realize how much you've been carrying." I listened calmly, allowing the words to settle without interruption. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I observed her, noting the subtle shift in her tone, her body language, the hesitancy that revealed discomfort with this newfound honesty. After a moment, I replied, "Lily, understanding is the first step. Now it's up to you to act differently." She nodded, almost imperceptibly, and left shortly afterward. The encounter brief, but meaningful. It was a small victory, not dramatic, not vindictive, but profoundly satisfying, because it represented acknowledgement, the first glimmer of change in behavior that had long been resistant to reality. Meanwhile, my parents continued to adjust, learning, perhaps reluctantly, that their daughter was no longer the default problem solver, the silent provider, or the one who would always absorb inconvenience. They began to make decisions independently, cover bills without relying on me, and even attempt to engage with Lily about responsibility in ways they hadn't before. The household tension, while present, became more honest, more transparent, and less dependent on manipulation or silent entrance. I felt a deep sense of calm watching these changes unfold, because they were a product of my quiet insistence on fairness and self-respect rather than public humiliation or drama. Around this time, I also began to explore opportunities that had previously been inaccessible, considering career advancements, networking events, and personal projects that I had postponed for years. Each step into autonomy reinforced my sense of empowerment, reminding me that the most profound revenge is often the one where you reclaim your own life, and the consequences for others rise naturally from their actions. Months passed, and the family dynamic continued to shift. Lily, now more aware of the limits of her entitlement, approached me cautiously, still testing boundaries, but no longer attempting to manipulate or mock me. My parents, observing these changes, seemed more reflective, more cautious in their expectations, and began to acknowledge the contributions I had made over the years, if not verbally, then through their actions asking for advice rather than demanding it, consulting me rather than assuming, and respecting my time and space. I realized that the quiet, methodical approach I had taken, the patience, the documentation, the firm boundaries, and the calm, consistent demonstration of my autonomy had been far more effective than any outburst could have been. It had allowed me to teach lessons about responsibility, respect, and gratitude without resorting to cruelty or confrontation for its own sake. And as I settled into this new balance, I felt a profound sense of relief, freedom, and empowerment. My revenge had not been about shaming or punishing. It had been about creating space for myself, allowing consequences to unfold naturally, and asserting a long overdue recognition of my worth. This calm, deliberate strategy reshaped not only my family relationships, but also my perception of myself. I was no longer the quiet, accommodating daughter. I was a woman capable of asserting her needs, defining her boundaries, and influencing outcomes without sacrificing her integrity. The transformation was subtle, not cinematic, but it was deep, irreversible, and profoundly satisfying. I began to see that true revenge is rarely about dramatic displays of anger or confrontation. It is about reclaiming power, setting boundaries, and letting the natural consequences of others' actions unfold, all while remaining calm, steady, and unshakable. And in that realization, I found a peace and clarity I had never known before, a sense that I had finally stepped into my own life, not as a caretaker defined by others' expectations, but as a woman fully aware of her worth and capable of quietly, confidently shaping the world around her. In the months following my decision to step back and assert myself, the family dynamic shifted in ways I had only imagined in quiet moments of reflection. And yet, even with all the changes, there were lessons that unfolded slowly, like ripples on a lake, gentle but undeniable, teaching me more about human nature, family, and my own resilience than any confrontation or argument ever could. I found that reclaiming my time and space allowed me to reconnect not only with friends and career opportunities, but with myself, the part of me that had been buried under decades of expectation, obligation, and unspoken labor. I started to pursue things I had postponed for years, traveling to small cities for work conferences, enrolling in creative classes I had always admired, and even learning to cook new dishes that reminded me of childhood comforts I had long forgotten in the rush of caring for everyone else. Each step in this new chapter felt like a small act of rebellion, not against my family out of spite, but against the pattern that had long trapped me in silent service. Lily's attitude gradually adjusted as well. At first, she resisted, testing boundaries and attempting the old tactics that had always worked before. But over time, she began to approach me with caution and a newfound awareness of my limits. The smirk that once masked her entitlement slowly faded into hesitance and, eventually, recognition. She started contributing financially in small ways, acknowledging that she could no longer rely entirely on my support, and even began taking on responsibilities she had habitually avoided, though she rarely admitted it aloud. My parents, meanwhile, seemed to understand the depth of my previous sacrifices for the first time, not fully at first, but with growing awareness. They sought my input in a more balanced way, refrained from assuming that I would automatically resolve every problem, and treated my decisions with a newfound respect. The old pattern of taking, dismissing, and ridiculing had begun to fracture, replaced by a more measured interaction that required effort and accountability from everyone involved. Through this transformation, I realized that my revenge had not been about punishing or shaming my family. It had been about teaching them the natural consequences of their reliance and entitlement, about demonstrating through action rather than anger that boundaries exist and that respect is not optional. I also noticed a profound internal change. The clarity and calm I had cultivated during this process gave me a sense of control and confidence I had never experienced before. I no longer measured my worth by the approval of others or allowed myself to be diminished by jokes at my expense. I had discovered that the quiet assertion of self-respect, combined with patience and careful planning, was more powerful than any explosive confrontation could ever be. Over time, the relationship between Lily and me evolved into something new. It was not perfect. There were still moments of tension and old habits that lingered, but there was also a growing recognition of each other's humanity, strengths, and limits. We began to interact with more honesty, and while the bond was different from before, it was healthier, based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. My parents, observing these changes, appeared to adjust their expectations and assumptions as well, learning slowly that honoring my autonomy did not mean I loved them any less. I began to understand a larger truth, that family loyalty is meaningful only when it is balanced with fairness, and that love does not require sacrificing one's own well-being for the sake of others' convenience or amusement. By stepping back, by documenting the years of support I had provided, and by asserting clear boundaries with calm determination, I had shifted the equilibrium of my life and my family in a way that brought not only respect, but also a profound sense of liberation. I had reclaimed my time, my energy, and my emotional space, and in doing so, I had discovered a quiet empowerment that was far more satisfying than any outward display of vengeance. Looking back on that dinner, the humiliation I felt, and the shock I saw on their faces when I spoke my truth, I now understood that moment as a turning point, a moment when I chose myself over obligation, clarity over fear, and long-term balance over temporary appeasement. That night, when I first drew the line, I couldn't have predicted the calm, measured, and ultimately effective course that would follow, but I trusted my instincts, my preparation, and my judgment. And in the end, the revenge I enacted was not loud or dramatic. It was the quiet, relentless assertion of self-worth and boundaries, which allowed natural consequences to unfold, giving me both freedom and insight. I now move through life with a heightened awareness of my own value and a calm confidence in my decisions, knowing that setting boundaries is not unkind, that withholding support is not selfish when it has been exploited, and that true empowerment often comes from patience, clarity, and steadfastness rather than immediate gratification or dramatics. I have learned that the most effective revenge is not in retaliation, but in reclaiming one's life, demonstrating respect for oneself, and allowing others to experience the results of their own choices. And so, as I continue to grow and live on my own terms, I carry with me the lessons of that night, the importance of patience, the power of calm assertiveness, and the freedom that comes when you finally stop giving your energy to those who take it for granted. If there's one thing I would like to share with you, it's this: never underestimate the quiet power of self-respect, the strength of calm determination, and the profound impact of setting boundaries. They are often more transformative than any act of anger or drama, and in my experience, they are the true path to reclaiming your life and asserting your value. And if you found this story meaningful, inspiring, or even just relatable, I encourage you to like this video, share it with someone who might benefit from it, and subscribe to my Calm Revenge for more stories of measured, thoughtful, and powerful moments where ordinary people reclaim control over their lives with patience, clarity, and quiet resolve.